They say your wedding day is the happiest day of your life. I used to believe that, too. In fact, I built my entire vision of happiness around that single day white dress, VOs beneath the setting sun, my family smiling in the front row. But I've learned that sometimes happiness doesn't come in the shape you expected. Sometimes it costs more than money. Sometimes it breaks your heart on its way in. My name is Eliza Monroe. I'm 32 years old, a senior editor at a publishing house in Manhattan, and until recently, I thought I had a strong sense of control over my life. I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, a place of oak trees and humidity and porch swings, where people knew your business before you told them. My parents, Peter and Diane Monroe, are both retired teachers devoted to their church, their garden, and their rigid routine. My younger sister, Emily, still lives in Charleston with her husband Matt and their 2 kids, Olivia and Tyler. We talk, but not often. Life gets in the way, as it tends to. I left Charleston when I was 22, chasing a dream of books and big cities. I didn't expect to stay in New York for more than a couple of years. But then I met Daniel. It was a Tuesday morning in October, the kind that smells like roasted chestnuts and cold pavement. I was running late to a meeting, juggling a manuscript and a croissant, when he bumped into me outside a coffee shop in Brooklyn Heights. His Americano exploded across the pages of my notes, and he looked at me like he'd committed murder. "I'm so sorry," he said, already trying to blot the pages with his flannel sleeve. "I'll buy you a new book, or 10. I laughed, despite myself. "You just ruined 6 months of edits. That coffee better be worth it." He looked sheepish and grinned. "Best in Brooklyn, I promise." And somehow, that led to coffee, then dinner, then a conversation about how we both hated small talk and loved obscure jazz vinyl. Before I knew it, we were inseparable. Daniel worked in nonprofit tech, helping underfunded school districts modernize their infrastructure. He was smart, quietly passionate, and the most emotionally available man I'd ever met. 4 years later, he proposed under the golden canopy of Central Park in the fall, when the whole city felt like a postcard. The ring was small, a vintage diamond set in a thin gold band. Nothing flashy. But when he knelt down in that crunchy bed of orange leaves, my entire life shifted. It was the kind of yes that came out of my mouth before I even processed it. We spent the next few months planning the wedding, and neither of us wanted a huge event. Just something beautiful, intimate, somewhere that felt alive. Santa Barbara came to mind almost immediately. We'd taken a trip there 2 years prior, stayed in a small bed and breakfast overlooking the sea, and swore we'd come back one day. It had vineyards, cliffs, sunsets that melted into the Pacific. It felt like the kind of place where love could breathe. But destination weddings are expensive. I knew that from the start. Daniel's family, his mom, Helen, and 2 brothers lived in Seattle, and they were happy to cover their own flights. But my family, they couldn't afford that kind of travel. My parents had been living off a fixed retirement income for years. And Emily's husband Matt worked construction steady work, but not the kind that left much extra for airfare and hotels. So I made a decision. I dipped into my savings, the account I'd built slowly over 8 years of late nights and skipped vacations, and I spent $20,000 to cover their costs. Flights from Charleston to Lax, a rented house just a few miles from the vineyard venue, big enough for all of them, a rental van, childcar seats, and even a bit extra for food and outings. I wanted to make it easy for them to say yes. I didn't want money to be the thing that stood in the way of them seeing me say I do. Daniel was hesitant at first. "That's a lot, babe. Are you sure?" "I'm sure," I said. "They're my family. I want them there. It won't feel complete without them." He nodded, and that was that. We booked everything, flights under their names, confirmations sent, itineraries planned. I spent hours coordinating the details, down to where they pick up the van at the airport. I even made little welcome packets with sunscreen and beach towels for the kids. It felt good, generous, hopeful. But hope, I've come to realize can be a dangerous thing. 3 weeks before the wedding, I called my mom just to check in, confirm the final pieces, see if they needed anything else before the trip. She sounded distracted when she answered, her voice distant like she was already somewhere far away. "Hey, Mom," I said. "Just confirming your arrival Wednesday, the 12th, right? I've got everything ready at the house in Montecito." There was a pause, one of those long, pregnant pauses that makes your stomach sink before you even know why. "Sweetheart, we need to talk about that." My heart thudded against my ribs. "What do you mean?" "Well," she said, too calmly, "your father and I decided not to come to California. We're going to Europe instead." At first, I thought I misheard her. "Europe?" "Yes," she said, like it was the most normal thing in the world. "We've always wanted to go. Paris, Rome, maybe London. And, well, since you already sent the money, we figured we'd finally do something for ourselves." I couldn't speak. I remember gripping the kitchen counter with one hand, phone pressed to my ear with the other, like the physical support might steady me emotionally. It didn't. "You used the money for the wedding to take a vacation to Europe. It was a gift, wasn't it?" she said, oblivious. "You wanted us to be happy." That's when I felt something shift inside me, like a wire snapping. That $20,000 wasn't just a financial gesture. It was love. It was belief. It was me reaching out, saying, "Please be part of my life." And they turned their backs on it for croissants and cathedrals. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just hung up and stood there in my kitchen in Manhattan with a heart that suddenly felt 20 grand emptier. I stood in my kitchen in total silence for nearly 20 minutes after hanging up the phone. The tile felt cold under my bare feet. The dishwasher hummed in the background, oblivious to the weight of what had just happened. It was a regular Tuesday in Manhattan, but everything inside me had cracked. I played my mom's words over and over again in my head. We figured we'd finally do something for ourselves. As if being at my wedding, my once-in-a-lifetime moment, was somehow a burden. As if my attempt to include them, to lift the financial strain from their shoulders, was an invitation to take advantage of me. It wasn't even the money. Not really. I could make the money back. What I couldn't recover was the sense of trust I had clung to all these years. The belief that, no matter how different we were, family would always show up when it counted. I thought my wedding day would bring us closer, maybe soften the growing distance between us. But instead, that distance had just turned into a canyon. That evening, I told Daniel, we were sitting at our tiny 2-seater kitchen table, eating reheated lentil soup and sourdough from the bakery down the block. I barely touched my spoon. He glanced at me. "You look like someone punched you in the soul." I gave a small, humorless laugh. That's one way to put it. I told him everything. The phone call, the Europe trip, how casually she'd explained it, how she'd used the word gift, like I'd handed over a birthday card with a check and not a carefully constructed itinerary tied to my most important day. He didn't say anything right away. He just listened, the way he always did, fully present. His eyes locked on mine, his expression quiet but fierce with concern. Finally, he said, "I'm so sorry, Eliza. That's not okay." I nodded, trying to hold back the sting in my throat. "I just don't understand how they could do this." "Who does that?" "People who've always put themselves first," he said softly. I flinched a little at that. They weren't always like this. I mean, my mom used to drive across town just to bring me soup when I had the flu. My dad taught me how to swim in the lake by our house. They showed up when I was a kid. Daniel reached for my hand, and somewhere along the way, something changed. I squeezed his fingers. I thought this would be different. I really thought this would matter to them. "It does matter," he said, "to the people who love you the way you deserve." The next few days passed in a blur of quiet sadness and logistical headaches. I had to cancel their flights, the airbin, the rental van. I lost over $1,000 in non-refundable deposits. Not that I cared much about that anymore. What haunted me was the silence. Neither my mom nor my dad followed up. No apology, no text, no checking in to see how I felt. It was like the whole thing had been a minor inconvenience to them, something they'd long moved on from. I wondered if they were already planning their wardrobe for Paris. If they were sitting at the kitchen table with a Rick Steves guidebook, circling cafes in Montmartre. Emily, on the other hand, did reach out. Hey, she texted. Mom told me about the trip. I didn't know they were using that money. That's messed up, Eliza. I'm sorry. I stared at the message for a while before replying. Are you still coming? She took hours to answer. When she finally did, the words were hesitant. I don't think we can swing it. With the kids and Matt's schedule. You know how it is. I stared at that message for a long time. I didn't know how it was. And yet I tried to make it not be that way. I had gone out of my way to remove every obstacle. I understand. I wrote back. I didn't say anything else. By the end of that week, the guest list was smaller by 6. I updated the caterer, adjusted the seating chart, took down the Monroe family place cards I had printed in gold foil. And then, alone in my bedroom, I cried. There's a grief no one warns you about, the grief of losing something you thought you could count on. Not through death or disaster, but through sheer neglect. The grief of realizing that people you love may not love you in the way you need, no matter how much you try to make it easy for them. And yet, through that fog, there were bright lights too. Lena, my best friend since college, showed up at my apartment with wine and sushi and declared, okay, you're allowed 24 more hours of sulking. And then we are moving on and making this the most incredible wedding anyone's ever seen. I gave her a weak smile. I'm not sulking. She raised an eyebrow. Girl, your playlist is nothing but Phoebe Bridgers and Bon Iver. That's industrial grade sulking. I laughed in spite of myself, and something inside me softened. Maybe this was what healing looked like, learning to laugh again. Even when the wound was still fresh. Daniel's mom, Helen, called me later that week. Sweetheart, she said, her voice warm and firm. I just want you to know that we're honored to be part of your wedding. I may not have raised you, but I'm proud to be gaining you as a daughter. That made me cry again, but for a different reason. I started to realize that love shows up in unexpected ways. Sometimes it doesn't come from the places you hoped. Sometimes it comes from the people who choose you not out of obligation, but because they see you, because they care. In the quiet moments that followed, I began to rewrite what my wedding would mean. Not a performance for anyone else, not a parade of approval from my parents, but a celebration of what I had built. A choice I was making with the man who loved me deeply. A day for truth, not appearances. They wouldn't be there, but I would be. Fully, entirely, and unapologetically present. And maybe that was enough. The morning of my wedding, I woke before the sun. The sky outside the windows of our rented cottage in Santa Barbara was still dark, brushed with the faintest hint of violet. The ocean in the distance humming quietly like a lullaby, still half asleep. I sat up in bed and looked around the room. Lena was curled on the pull-out sofa in the corner, snoring softly, a silk robe hanging off one shoulder. On the desk sat my bouquet, pale roses, ivory peonies, olive branches all tied together with a ribbon the color of storm clouds. I had chosen it because it reminded me of strength, not sweetness. I made myself tea and stepped outside barefoot. The stone patio was cool under my feet. The vineyard behind us was still, sleeping, waiting for the sun to wake the grapes. For a moment, I let myself pretend I wasn't getting married today. Not because I didn't want to, I did, but because the weight of what was missing made the day feel strangely hollow. I hadn't heard from my parents since the phone call. Not even a text. Not a card. Not even a cheap email. They were, presumably, somewhere in Europe. Maybe walking along the Seine. Maybe sipping espresso in Rome. Maybe smiling and snapping photos while I stood half a world away in a white dress, wondering if they'd ever really understood me at all. At around 7, Lena stumbled out with bedhead and mascara still smudged from the night before. She yawned and put her arm around me. You okay? She asked, eyes squinting in the sunrise. I nodded. Getting there. By 10, the hair and makeup team had arrived. The house filled with the smell of hot curling irons, hairspray, and cinnamon muffins someone had brought. My friend Jasmine handed me a mimosa and told me to stop looking like someone. Just read me a sad poem. I smiled at her, working on it. There was laughter in the air, the kind of giddy excitement that builds when women gather for something sacred. But beneath it all, a current of grief still ran under my skin. Every time I looked at the chair where my mother was supposed to sit, the silence screamed a little louder. My dress was perfect, simple but elegant. Long sleeves of delicate lace, a soft train that trailed behind like a whisper, and a neckline just modest enough to make me feel like myself. I looked in the mirror and thought, this is the best version of me I've ever seen. And my mother will never know what I looked like today. When it was time to walk down the aisle, the planner came to ask who would be escorting me. No one, I said. She blinked. Are you sure? I know Daniel's brother. I'm sure. Lena touched my arm, gently. You don't have to do it alone. But I did. I needed to. There was something symbolic about it. Something important about walking that path with no one holding my elbow. I had arrived at this moment despite everything. Despite the absence. Despite the silence. Despite the pain. This was mine. The ceremony took place just before sunset, under a wooden arch draped in eucalyptus and linen. Rows of chairs lined the vineyard lawn, the aisle scattered with petals. Our officiant, a friend of Daniel's named Mark, stood waiting with a kind smile. Music played softly a string version of First Day of My Life. And then the doors opened. Everyone stood. Everyone turned. But there was no father giving me away. There was only me, in a sea of eyes, walking toward the man who waited at the end of the aisle with love on his face and a single tear shining in the corner of his eye. The sky was painted in layers rose gold, apricot, deepening blues. As I walked, I felt the ache of the missing, yes, but also the presence of everything that was here. My friends, Daniel's family, the life we were beginning, the promise we were making. When I reached him, Daniel took my hand and whispered, "You're breathtaking." I almost cried, but I didn't. I held it together because I needed to stand tall. I needed to prove to myself that I could. The ceremony was short, heartfelt, filled with laughter and a few sniffles from the crowd. We exchanged vows that we'd written ourselves. Mine were messy and real and imperfect. I can't promise I'll always be brave, but I promise I'll always come back to us, even when it's hard. When the kiss came, it felt less like a performance and more like an anchor being dropped, a grounding, a beginning. The reception followed, lit by fairy lights strung between oak trees, long farmhouse tables filled with wine and food and laughter. Daniel's mom, Helen, gave a speech that left everyone in tears. "You are a gift to this family, Eliza," she said, "not because you married into it, but because of who you are. Strong, thoughtful, real. I couldn't be prouder to call you my daughter-in-law." That's when I cried. There were toasts and clinking glasses and first dances and awkward ones. But when the DJ announced the father-daughter dance, I quietly signaled him to skip it. Lena noticed. "You sure?" "Positive," I said. Instead, I danced with Olivia, my niece, Emily's daughter. She was only 7, but she twirled me like a pro. For a moment, that small hand in mine made me feel lighter, like the next generation might grow up knowing how to do better. Later that night, when the crowd had thinned and the music had softened, Daniel and I returned to our cottage. I kicked off my shoes, exhausted down to the bone. He helped me out of my dress, careful not to tug too hard at the lace. Then he handed me a glass of red wine and sat beside me on the edge of the bed. We didn't speak for a while. The silence between us wasn't heavy, just full. Full of everything we'd carried all day. Finally, I said it. "I don't know how I'll forgive them." He took a sip of wine and nodded. "You don't have to tonight." And that was it. No platitudes. No pressure. Just permission to feel what I felt on my own timeline. That night, as I lay beside my husband, I realized something vital. I hadn't just married Daniel. I had also chosen myself. I had walked through the pain, stood beneath the weight of disappointment, and said yes anyway. That's something my parents might never understand, but I do. And that will always be enough. 6 months have passed since our wedding, and the world feels both unfamiliar and entirely my own. After everything that happened, Daniel and I decided to start fresh. We left the noise of New York behind and moved west to Denver, Colorado, a place with clean air, open sky, and enough quiet to finally hear ourselves think. He got an offer from a nonprofit tech firm. Here, one of those hybrid startups with ethical goals and Mountain View conference rooms. I kept my position at the publishing house, but now work remotely, usually from our cozy second-floor office with a window that overlooks a maple tree and a row of sleepy townhomes. Our days are simple in the best way. We take long walks in Washington Park. We try every brunch place we can find. We argue over book choices for our monthly marriage book club, which, admittedly, is mostly just an excuse to drink wine in sweatpants. Life is good, but it's different. Sometimes I still wake up and feel the phantom ache of something missing, an echo of the pain I carried down the aisle. The absence of my parents from that day didn't just scar the memory of the wedding. It rewrote something deeper. Something about the roles we assign people and what it means when they don't live up to them. A month after the wedding, a postcard arrived from Florence, Italy. The handwriting was unmistakable, my mother's careful cursive. "We hope you had a wonderful day. Europe was magical. Love, Mom and Dad." That was it. No apology. No explanation. Just a breezy acknowledgement of a milestone missed. I stared at the card for a long time. The image on the front was of the Ponte Vecchio, sunlit and picturesque. I wondered if they had someone take a photo of them smiling in front of it. I wondered if they even thought about what they'd given up. I didn't respond. I slid the postcard into the back of a drawer, not as an act of bitterness, but as a quiet boundary. I needed space. I needed to understand who I was now, apart from the daughter who had once believed love could be bought with airline tickets and convenience. In the weeks that followed, I tried to process everything through writing. I filled pages in my journal with letters I'd never sent. One to my mom, asking her how she could prioritize sightseeing in Rome over watching me take the biggest step of my life. One to my dad, wondering if he'd felt even a flicker of guilt as he boarded that plane. And one to Emily, my sister, asking why she didn't fight harder to come. But eventually, I stopped writing them, not because I had nothing left to say, but because I had finally started saying those things to myself. One Sunday in late April, I sat with Daniel on the back patio as we sipped coffee and watched the squirrels play tag along the fence. I turned to him, unprompted, and said, "I think I'm done waiting for them to say sorry." He didn't ask who I meant. He knew. I continued, "I think if I wait for that, I'll just keep letting them take up space in my head." He nodded. Letting go doesn't mean pretending it didn't happen. It just means you don't let it define you anymore. I leaned against his shoulder. I want to define myself differently now. And I did. Over the next few months, I built a life that didn't orbit around the idea of approval. I strengthened my friendships. Lena and I started a virtual book club together, inviting women from all over who'd been through similar hurts. We called it the Second Circle, a nod to the people you choose after the first ring of your life lets you down. I grew closer to Helen, Daniel's mom, too. One weekend she flew in from Seattle just to spend time with me. We wandered through the Denver Botanic Gardens, sipping lattes and talking about life. At lunch, she reached across the table and held my hand. "I know I'm not your mother," she said, "but I'll always show up like one if you let me." And I believed her. My relationship with Emily stayed lukewarm. She checked in every now and then sent photos of the kids, forwarded memes she thought I'd like, but she never addressed what happened. I never pushed. Maybe some relationships are meant to stay shallow until the people involved decide to dig deeper, and maybe they never will. That's a truth I've started to accept. The hardest part was unlearning the guilt. For a long time, I questioned if I had expected too much. Maybe my parents really did need that trip to Europe. Maybe I'd backed them into a corner by offering to pay for everything. But every time that thought crept in, I reminded myself, love is not a transaction, and gratitude shouldn't look like abandonment. That $20,000 didn't just buy plane tickets. It bought me clarity. It showed me who I could count on. And more importantly, it showed me what I was capable of surviving. Because I did survive. More than that, I grew. I walked down that aisle alone, but I didn't leave it that way. I walked into a partnership, into a new chapter, into a life that was entirely of my own making. And the people who stood by me, they were the ones who mattered. Sometimes I still get questions from colleagues or distant acquaintances. Did your family come to the wedding? I always answer truthfully, no. They chose to go to Europe instead. The reactions range from awkward silences to stunned expressions. A few people ask follow-ups, others don't. But I no longer tell the story to gain sympathy or justify my pain. I tell it because it's mine, because surviving it is part of who I am now. In this new life Daniel and I have built, I've learned that some stories don't get clean endings. Some wounds don't get stitched up with apologies. Sometimes the people you thought would protect, you end up being the ones you need protection from. But I also learned something else. The family you build can be louder than the one you lost. Love doesn't always look like blood. Sometimes it looks like showing up. Sometimes it looks like dancing with your niece at your wedding instead of your father. Sometimes it looks like a friend holding your hand in silence, or a husband who says nothing, but gives you everything. I spent $20,000 to bring my family to my wedding. They never came. But what I got in return, a sense of my own worth, a quiet strength, a beginning I'll never have to question. And that, I think, is the greatest wedding gift of all.